The city was alive with bright lights and expensive cars. Among them was Mr. Richard Carter, a wealthy businessman known for his success. He had everything: mansions, luxury cars, and more money than he could ever spend. People admired him, but he had no sympathy for those less fortunate. Not far from his towering office building lived a struggling family. John, the father, had lost his job months ago. His wife Sarah did her best to support their 2 young children, but the little money she earned wasn't enough. Their fridge was empty, and the kids went to bed hungry. One evening, John made a difficult decision. He swallowed his pride and stepped out onto the cold streets. He had to find help, anything to feed his children. As he walked past fancy restaurants, he saw people dining on lavish meals. The smell of grilled steak and fresh bread made his stomach ache. But John wasn't looking for a feast. He just needed enough to buy a loaf of bread. Then he spotted a man stepping out of an expensive restaurant. It was Richard Carter. John hesitated for a moment, then gathered his courage and approached him. John took a deep breath and stepped forward. His hands trembled as he approached Richard Carter, the wealthy businessman who had just finished an extravagant dinner. The scent of fine wine and grilled steak lingered in the air. "Excuse me, sir," John said, his voice low but desperate. I'm sorry to bother you, but my family hasn't eaten in 2 days. I've lost my job, and my kids are hungry. Please, anything would help." Richard turned slowly, adjusting his expensive suit. He looked John up and down, his expression cold and unimpressed. "You want my money?" Richard scoffed. "Why don't you get a job like everyone else?" "I've tried, sir," John said, swallowing his pride. "I just need enough to buy food for my children. I'm not asking for much." Richard smirked and shook his head. "You people always have excuses. Hard work is the only way to success. No one helped me. I built everything on my own." John's heart sank. He wasn't expecting pity, but he had hoped for a little kindness. "Please, sir," he whispered. Richard took a step back as if John's desperation was contagious. "I don't give handouts," he said firmly. Then, without another word, he walked past John and climbed into his luxury car. As the engine roared to life, John stood frozen, watching the taillights disappear. His stomach clenched, not just from hunger, but from the cold, harsh reality of the world. He turned around and slowly walked home, wondering how he would tell his family that there would be no dinner again tonight. Richard Carter drove through the city, feeling no guilt about what had just happened. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. Life was tough, and only the strongest survived. He had built his empire from the ground up. If he could do it, why couldn't others? As he pulled into his grand estate, the gates opened automatically. The mansion stood tall, its massive glass windows glowing under the night sky. A servant rushed to open his car door, bowing slightly as Richard stepped out. Inside, his world was one of absolute comfort. A warm fire crackled in the marble fireplace, and a glass of the finest whiskey awaited him. He settled into his leather chair, scrolling through business news on his phone. Profits were rising, stocks were stable, and his company was thriving. Later that night, he invited some of his wealthy friends over for drinks. They laughed and talked about money, investments, and success. "A beggar tried to ask me for money today," Richard said with a smirk. "Said his family was starving." His friends chuckled. "They always have a story," one of them added. "They just want easy money." Richard took a sip of his whiskey. "Exactly. If you work hard, you'll never be in that position." He truly believed it. In his mind, the poor were simply lazy. The next morning, Richard walked into his company's headquarters, greeting employees with his usual confidence. His office sat on the top floor, overlooking the city. From here, he felt invincible, like a king ruling over his empire. But what he didn't know was that his world was about to change. Mistakes had been made, risks had been taken, and soon Richard Carter would face the one thing he never believed in: karma. Richard Carter sat in his towering office, confident as ever. Business had always been smooth, and he saw no reason to worry. But that morning, something felt off. His secretary walked in, her face unusually tense. "Sir, there's an issue," she said hesitantly. "Our biggest investor just pulled out." Richard frowned. "What? That's impossible." She placed a folder on his desk. "They've withdrawn all funding, effective immediately." Richard snatched the papers, scanning them quickly. His jaw tightened. This investor held a major stake in his company. Losing them meant serious trouble. Minutes later his phone buzzed. Another investor was pulling out. Then another. Within hours his company's stock plummeted. His confidence turned to frustration. He called meetings trying to fix the mess. But it was too late. His company had taken too many risky investments, and now everything was collapsing. By the end of the week, banks were calling, demanding payments on massive loans. His assets were tied up and his cash flow was drying up fast. One by one, his business partners distanced themselves. Those who once praised him now avoided his calls. The media caught wind of the disaster, and headlines branded him as a failure. His employees, the same ones he had looked down on, were now out of jobs. He had no choice but to start selling his possessions. First the expensive cars, then the vacation homes. At night, he sat in his nearly empty mansion staring at his phone, no messages, no calls. His so-called friends had vanished. He poured himself a drink, but it no longer tasted like success. The world that once praised him, now mocked him. He had always believed wealth was a shield, protecting him from misfortune. But now, as his company crumbled and his fortune slipped away, he realized how fragile everything truly was. And for the first time in years, Richard Carter felt fear. Richard Carter never imagined his life could change so fast. Just weeks ago, he was a powerful businessman, surrounded by wealth and luxury. Now, he was drowning in debt, desperately trying to hold on to what little he had left. One morning, he received the final blow. His mansion was being seized by the bank. He had missed too many payments, and there was nothing left to cover the debt. He stood in his once grand living room, now filled with boxes. His expensive furniture, paintings, and designer suits, everything was being taken away. A loud knock at the door made his heart sink. The bank's representatives had arrived. "Mr. Carter, it's time," one of them said. With no choice, he stepped outside. The gates of his mansion, which had once opened for his luxury cars, now closed behind him for the last time. With only a small suitcase, he walked aimlessly through the city. He had no home, no car, and no one to call. His so-called friends had abandoned him the moment he lost his wealth. Days turned into weeks. He moved into a tiny, run-down apartment. The walls were thin, the air smelled of dampness, and the floors creaked with every step. His expensive suits no longer mattered. He had no business meetings to attend, no employees to impress. Instead, he spent his days searching for jobs. But rejection after rejection came. No one wanted to hire a failed businessman with no real skills outside of boardrooms. His money ran out quickly. Soon, he struggled to afford even a simple meal. Hunger, something he had never experienced before, became his daily companion. One evening, he found himself sitting on a park bench, weak and exhausted. He had spent the whole day looking for work, but nothing had changed. For the first time, he understood the pain of the people he once ignored. The people he looked down on, the ones who begged for help. He was one of them now, and he had no idea how much further he would fall. The nights were the hardest, cold, lonely, and filled with hunger. Richard Carter, once a man of power and wealth, now sat on a worn-out bench near a local shelter. His suit was wrinkled, his shoes scuffed, and his stomach empty. He had never imagined this life, a life where he had to count pennies, where every meal was uncertain, where no one cared if he lived or died. That night, the wind was harsh. He wrapped his thin coat around himself, shivering. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The world around him blurred as weakness took over. Then a voice broke through the silence. "Excuse me, sir. Are you okay?" Richard looked up slowly. A man stood in front of him, holding a small plastic bag. The scent of warm bread filled the air. Richard squinted. The man looked familiar. Then it hit him. It was him. The same man he had refused to help, the father who had begged him for food weeks ago. Richard's heart pounded. Shame burned through him. He wanted to disappear, to run away, but he had nowhere to go. John, the poor man he had once mocked, now looked at him with concern, not hatred. He crouched down, opening the bag and handing Richard a sandwich. "Here," John said softly, "eat." Richard hesitated. His pride screamed at him to refuse, but his hunger was stronger. He took the sandwich with trembling hands and took a small bite. The taste of food, simple as it was, almost brought tears to his eyes. John sat beside him. "I know how it feels," he said after a moment, "to have nothing, to wonder if you'll make it another day." Richard swallowed hard. Why are you helping me?" His voice was hoarse, Weak, John sighed, because I know what it's like to be ignored, and I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone. Richard stared at the ground, unable to respond. John continued, Come with me. My wife made soup. It's not much, but it's warm. Richard wanted to refuse. He didn't deserve kindness, not after what he had done, but his body betrayed him. He was too weak, too exhausted. Slowly, he nodded. John helped him to his feet, and together they walked toward a small, run-down apartment, the same kind Richard had once looked down on. For the first time in his life, he understood what true kindness looked like. And for the first time, he had no choice but to accept it. Richard Carter sat at the small wooden table in John's tiny apartment. The room was warm, filled with the comforting smell of homemade soup. It wasn't a grand meal, nothing like the expensive dishes he once enjoyed, but tonight, it was everything. Sarah, John's wife, placed a steaming bowl in front of him. Their 2 children sat nearby, eating quietly. Despite their struggles, there was a warmth in this home, something Richard had never felt in his mansion. He picked up the spoon with shaky hands and took a bite. The soup was simple, but after days of hunger, it tasted better than any gourmet meal he had ever had. John sat across from him. You can stay here for a while, he said, until you get back on your feet. Richard froze. He could hardly believe it. Why? He asked. After how I treated you, why are you helping me? John sighed, stirring his soup. Because life is unpredictable, he said. I was in your position once, working, stable. Then one day everything was gone. I begged for help and no one listened. It could happen to anyone. Richard swallowed hard. His past words haunted him. He had once mocked this man for asking for help. He had called the poor lazy. And yet the very person he had looked down on was now showing him kindness. Sarah smiled gently. We don't have much, but we know what it's like to struggle. And we know how it feels when no one cares. Richard lowered his head. For the first time in his life, he truly understood. Wealth didn't define a person. Success wasn't about money. It was about kindness, about helping those in need, something he had never done. That night he lay on the small couch they had given him. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than the cold streets. He stared at the ceiling, deep in thought. His entire life, he had believed that hard work was all that mattered. That if someone was poor, it was their fault. But now, he knew better. Life could change in an instant. And the only thing that truly mattered was how people treated each other when they had nothing left.